Now, if there's anything that the science makes really clear, it's that the more people who are carrying guns around in public, the more shootings you're going to have, the more aggravated assaults you're going to have, the more homicides. So from the jump, the Supreme Court saying we need to allow more people to be carrying guns in public, put New Jerseyans at risk. It put folks in New York at risk, and a handful of other states that had similar laws.
Welcome to Pod Talks. Pod Talks is a project of protecting our democracy. We bring together the best minds in New Jersey and beyond to talk about some of the biggest challenges facing our democracy, our institutions, and our personal freedoms. I'm Sean Spiller, Chair of Protecting Our Democracy. Today, we are honored to be joined by Adam Skaggs, Chief Counsel and Vice President of the Giffords Law Center. Giffords is a leading national organization to combat gun violence, founded by former U.S. Representative Gabby Giffords, who many of us remember was shot in a horrific act of gun violence. We are very grateful that you made the time to be with us here today, Adam, and I know we've got a lot to talk about. Before we dive into that, I know that it'll be a great conversation, and I'll let Adam speak a lot about it, but I do want to acknowledge and share a little bit of the work Adam's been doing. Before joining Giffords, Adam served as a senior counsel at Everytown for gun safety and at the Brennan Center for Justice, where he worked on election law issues. Adam was also a litigation associate at Paul Weiss, Rifkind and Wharton and Garrison, and a law clerk at the 11th Circuit in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Adam's commentary has been published in Slate, Politico, The Atlantic, and New York Times, among other publications, and he has been widely quoted by media ranging from Wall Street Journal, Fox News, New York Times, and MSNBC. Adam graduated summa cum laude from Brooklyn Law School, received an MS in Urban Affairs from Hunter College of the University of New York, and he holds a BA, awarded with distinction from Swarthmore College. Adam, thank you for joining us, and it's great to have you here. And wish it was about something different, but unfortunately, it seems like every day we're brought back to the conversation around gun violence in one place or another in this country, unlike so many other places. So thank you for being here today to talk about it.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Sean. It's good to be able to spend some time with you today. Appreciate the opportunity, and thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction. Glad to be with you for this conversation today.
Well, I'll say this: I appreciate it's a kind introduction, but it really speaks to the work you've done for a lot of years now in this space specifically, and more broadly about fighting for people. But let's get to it and talking about specifically the challenges that we're facing with gun violence. You are frontline here. Tell us and tell our listeners a little bit about Giffords and the work that you do as chief counsel. Certainly a very prominent national organization. What's the current focus of Giffords and your work specifically, and how we move the conversation from maybe what some of the successes we've seen nationally of late, and maybe some of the challenges we still face?
Sure. Happy to share just a little background. I think you've already introduced the organization pretty effectively. So Giffords it's a national gun safety organization. We are led by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords. And my work there involves overseeing our legal, our policy and litigation work, as well as our research. So very quickly, the research team at Giffords, reviews all the current social science that's coming out, makes sure that we have the very latest information and best data to inform the policies we support and the priorities that we have. On our policy side, we have a group of attorneys that analyzes thousands of bills that are introduced in states and in Congress every year. These are good gun bills that will make our country a safer place, bad gun bills that'll do the opposite. And we work to advise advocates and legislators about the most important policies that they can pass. We've worked for years with the legislature in New Jersey. The Murphy administration, as you know, has been a real national leader around this issue. Attorney General Platkin has been a national leader. So we are thrilled at the relationships we have in New Jersey and states around the country to make sure we can protect as many lives as we can from gun violence. And then finally, there's our litigation arm, which both helps to defend gun laws that are challenged by the NRA and other gun lobby lawyers. And then we also bring some cases every year to challenge bad gun laws or to challenge bad actors that are, engaging in dangerous business practices that contribute to gun violence. So that's kind of the overview. of the organization and our work. And then I would just say, in terms of sort of successes and challenges, you know, last year, we're actually almost exactly a year out from when we passed the most consequential gun legislation in Congress in a generation, about 30 years. You look back 10 years ago after the Sandy Hook shooting, and even a modest background check bill that was introduced in Congress failed to pass. And a lot of people at the time after Sandy Hook said, if we are not going to act after this horrific tragedy, when are we ever going to do it? Well, after Sandy Hook, the gun safety movement really increased, and Giffords was established and has worked very hard to lay a foundation for progress over 10 years. So almost exactly 10 years after Sandy Hook, we had a very similar horrific shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. And a month to the day after that horrific incident, President Biden signed what's called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And like I said, that's the first really significant federal gun legislation in a generation, about 30 years. It's not perfect. It's not a silver bullet, if you'll excuse the expression, to solve all of gun violence, but it's making a real difference. And just last week, President Biden joined Senator Murphy and folks from Giffords in Connecticut to mark that 1-year anniversary of that really consequential bill. Real quick, you also asked for the biggest challenges. I'll say in a word, the Supreme Court. Again, almost about exactly a year ago, we got a dangerous decision from the Supreme Court that struck down part of New York's concealed carry law. That had implications for about states with about a quarter of the U.S. population that had to go and adjust their laws to take account of this dangerous legislation. And that's judicial decision. And that's another area where we've worked around the country, and in particular in New Jersey, with legislators to try and address some of the damage that the dangerous Supreme Court has done.
Well, there's certainly a lot there, but I think that speaks to how many fronts that we have to engage on to try and be successful. And I'm glad you highlighted, though, I think oftentimes, so many find themselves, pushing to try and see action taken in this regard. And very frustrating, just to see how little gets done. But we shouldn't lose hope, as you note. Some of the most consequential gun safety legislation that we've seen, did move, right, and did get passed. So that's a positive. We should celebrate that when we see those successes, and of course, understanding there's still much more to be done. You mentioned in there, I know that New Jersey, after the ruling from the Supreme Court, was quick to act to make sure that doing everything it could to put residents in a safe space. Happy to see right now that we had a circuit court uphold some of the pieces of the law that Jersey passed. But you note that it there are so many things, I guess, that the spaces you work in, both whether you're challenging something in the courts, looking for better legislation. You guys give out grades, right? Giffords gives grades. New Jersey has an A. Probably not a surprise to anyone from New Jersey that we have very strong gun safety laws, and therefore we've got thankfully, a lower gun death rate than many other states. When you look at a place like Mississippi, they get an F, and you can imagine, they have a much higher gun death rate. But what are all the pieces that go into maybe that grade that you give, and do you weigh more heavily in some areas than another that have bigger impact, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right that New Jersey's right there at the top of the list in terms of the strength of their laws. I should just say, as a proud native New Jerseyan, it gives me great pleasure to know that my home state is really leading the nation. And again, I really I want to shout out the leadership of Governor Murphy, Attorney General Placken. I think as well as the leaders in the legislature who have so courageously stood up to the gun lobby to strengthen New Jersey's laws. And you're absolutely right. The states, our research has shown this time and again, and others' research has shown this time and again, the states with the stronger gun laws have lower rates of gun violence. Conversely, the states that have the weakest, most permissive laws have gun violence rates that just, dwarf what, folks, for instance, in the Garden State are experiencing. That's a really good thing. The way we assess the strength of state laws is a very detailed and complex formula or algorithm, you could say, that I don't want to get bogged down in details. But, we have a matrix of, dozens of different kinds of laws. And these are laws from, let's say, does a state require a permit to purchase a gun, or do they require a permit to carry a gun in public? If so, what are the standards? Do they prohibit different types of dangerous people from buying or possessing or carrying guns? Do they have, laws that are designed to keep guns safely stored and out of the reach of children? Do they give tools to law enforcement and family members to seek a court order if a family member or somebody known to law enforcement has made threats of, let's say, committing suicide or committing a school shooting? A lot of states in recent years have adopted these laws that allow people to go to court and seek an order that temporarily removes guns from somebody who's in crisis, and then after the crisis is over, they can get their guns back, or they can have the ability to buy a gun reinstated. So we look at all of those laws, and the sort of weight that we assign them in terms of assigning a grade is informed by the science, the research that's out there. Obviously, laws where there's a very strong social science saying these really do a lot to save lives. Those are going to be weighted more heavily than laws where it's a little less clear how impactful a particular kind of a policy is. And we sort of run all those numbers. We update every year depending on what legislation has been passed. If a state like New Jersey has strengthened their gun laws, we put that data in. Other states are sort of in a race to the bottom where they're striking down various laws, put that data in as well. And, some states have an A, some have an F, and some are sort of distributed in between. But we really do see, it's obviously not sort of, 1 to 50 pure relationship, but by and large, and we've seen this year upon year upon year, the states who have this, who are at the top of the list in terms of the strongest gun laws have the lowest rates of gun violence, and exactly the opposite at the other end of the spectrum. So, we share this tool both, or we share this scoring system, this report card, if you will, both to sort of educate the public about the importance of gun policy and gun laws, but also as a way to convince advocates and legislators of the importance of passing these. I think it's a really, listeners should check this out. If they look at the gun law scorecard, they can go to Giffords.org and look for the scorecard, and they can, see how their state ranks and matches up against the rest of the country. I think it's visually very compelling data, but it really just makes, a very powerful case that, the laws we know save lives really do so and are important, and hopefully will inform the public and get them to try and convince their legislators to pass some important life-saving legislation.
So I guess, and maybe speaking a little selfishly here, with a family myself, and certainly the concerns you have for your kids and broadly our state. You mentioned briefly, I did as well, that, New Jersey, we know, does have some of the strongest laws and most effective laws, and that is great. We also noted the Supreme Court decision that has, in many ways kind of undermined some of the laws that we've seen in places like New Jersey. We did see that circuit court a couple of days ago. I think it was a 2-1 decision, kind of uphold some of those pieces. But what are we going to see in New Jersey, right? How do you think that goes as it probably works its way through the courts? Do you think that New Jersey continues to be successful, at least in the spaces that it deemed as places guns can't be carried? Do you see that our state being successful moving forward? And broadly, however it's finally reaches its conclusion, what's the impact on New Jersey, where we had some of these strongest laws? They have been, no matter what you want to say and how this does, they've been undermined by the Supreme Court. So people are, at least in some spaces, going to be carrying weapons and, in ways that they weren't allowed to before. I guess the obvious piece is that it's got to make us less safe, I guess, is the answer, right? Is there a way we can combat that in some way, or are we just forced to live with it because of a Supreme Court decision?
Yeah, unfortunately, what the Supreme Court said essentially a year ago, and this had to do with a New York law. So it was a New York case, but New York had a law that's very similar to what New Jersey had for, in New York's case, more than 100 years, and about the same in New Jersey. And basically, it limited the number of people who had a permit to carry a concealed handgun in public. Now, what the Supreme Court's decision said essentially and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but it said, look, you can't be as restrictive in giving out permits. You can still require someone to get a permit before they can carry a gun in public, but you have to be more permissive. You have to issue permits to more people. Now, if there's anything that the science makes really clear, it's that the more people who are, but it didn't make the state powerless to try and combat gun violence. And what I mean by that is, okay, it said you have to be more permissive about who gets permits to carry, but that doesn't mean they can bring a gun into a bar where people are drinking. It doesn't mean people can bring a gun to, Giant Stadium or, a venue where there's theater or concerts, movie theaters. So what New Jersey did, and I credit the legislature for the outstanding job they did, is they said, okay, we need to change the concealed carry law because of what the Supreme Court said. But what we can do is, while we have to be a little more permissive about the permitting standards, we can also be more thoughtful and more careful about the places where you can and can't carry guns. And so New Jersey passed legislation that designated a number of sensitive places where it said it was inappropriate and not permissible to carry guns. So we're talking about things like bars where alcohol is served, parks, recreation facilities, libraries, the whole host of different locations where, for obvious reasons, it's inappropriate to have people carrying guns. I mean, think about it. People are at a ball game, they're drinking beer, and tempers are flaring. Does anyone really think it's going to keep us safer to let people in there carrying guns? Of course not. So the New Jersey legislature acted consistent with common sense, and they acted consistent with the history of regulating guns in this country, and they designated a number of these locations as sensitive and where guns were prohibited. Now, unfortunately, the gun lobby, of course, as they always do, because when it comes to guns, no good deed, no good policy goes unchallenged in court. The gun lobby brought a lawsuit. They tried to have the entire law struck down. And unfortunately, it landed in front of a judge who took kind of an extremist approach to it, and the judge enjoined a lot of the law. The judge issued an order that said New Jersey couldn't enforce it, and that you had to allow guns, for example, in parks and that sort of thing. Thankfully, the Attorney General Platkin, promptly appealed. His office went to the appeals court. They filed a request for a stay of that lower court ruling. And as you said, Sean, earlier this week, we were thrilled that 3-judge panel on the appeals court, it's called the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, issued an order that basically reversed most of what that lower court judge had done. So reinstated really the vast majority of those sensitive places. So that appeal is still technically ongoing. There will be additional briefs filed and arguments held. But I think that order that came out this week is a pretty good indication of what the court is likely to do. And the big takeaway there is that New Jersey legislators, acted appropriately after the Supreme Court decision. The New Jersey Attorney General acted appropriately to defend that law when it was challenged in court. And as of this week, those provisions are back in force, and New Jerseyans are safer for it.
Yeah, no question. And let's hope it holds as it moves through the courts there. I guess along those lines, so when we talk about, which laws, which pieces are most effective, or maybe even something outside of the law that's most effective, what do you say to someone new? We often hear about, first off, there's more guns than people, right? We hear that a lot, that cited. And, there's so many mass shootings now that it's just so unfortunate that it's almost like people say, like, which one are you referencing? And we also have to acknowledge that there's so many people who are both killed and injured with guns that aren't part of a quote unquote, mass shooting event. But that's commonplace as well. What's the best way to curb that? Is it a law? Is there, like I said, is one thing, but maybe are there specific laws that really seem to be effective, or maybe even other strategies that aren't specifically codified in law that have been most effective in your experience and work over the years?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been talking about laws that limit guns being carried in public, and there's study after study showing that more people carrying guns in public, more people are going to get shot and injured. So, putting some common sense restrictions, as New Jersey has done on where guns are carried, is a really important measure. Background checks, universal background checks to buy a gun. Some listeners may be surprised that in most of the country you can get a gun without a background check. If you buy it from a federally licensed gun dealer, you'd have to take a background check. But in much of the country, you can just buy it from a stranger, who lists it in a classified ad, and you meet him in the parking lot of the McDonald's and just hand over, cash, hand over the gun, no questions asked. So requiring background checks on gun sales would go a long way. I mentioned earlier these what we call extreme risk laws that allow someone to go to court and say this person's threatening to shoot up a school, or this person's really in a mental health crisis and is thinking about suicide. Let's temporarily take their guns away. Those laws have been shown to be particularly effective at preventing suicide, but also at preventing mass shootings. So that's another tool. There are a number of other laws and policies that I could tick through, but I think those are some of the big ones. But I guess I would say, as much as our work focuses on strengthening gun laws and studying the effects of strengthened gun laws, that's only part of the solution. And ultimately, we need, a comprehensive, every multi-pronged, multi-strand approach to fighting gun violence. One of the most important things we can do is fund groups that are on the ground in communities that are hard hit by gun violence. Sean, you said, we hear so much about mass shootings, but then there's this day-to-day gun violence in cities and communities around the country that sadly, unfortunately, doesn't get the same kind of media coverage as a school shooting or, some of the other horrible mass shootings we've seen in recent years. And in those communities where gun violence is kind of concentrated, what we have learned is that while entire communities suffer, it's really a small percentage of the community that is most directly tied to gun violence. And what I mean by that is that it's a very small percentage of the population that is most at risk of either perpetrating a shooting or being shot. And so we can have targeted interventions in those communities that seek to interrupt cycles of violence, seek to intervene and prevent violence. And, some of that is having folks who have lived experience, who have maybe experienced violence in their past, that have credibility with folks involved in gun violence, actually going out and, speaking with and deterring gun violence. It's about providing support services and support for folks so that they understand there are better, choices to make and better options for their lives than getting involved in cycles of violence. And we are really pleased that in recent years, we've been successful in getting the federal government to allocate millions of dollars to support these community violence intervention programs. New Jersey, again, is a leader in the state funding these efforts and working with community groups. We just had an annual celebration where we, I'm happy to say, honored a group that's really doing critical life-saving work in Paterson. And so, I think in addition to thinking about how we can strengthen laws and give law enforcement tools to address gun violence, we need to also engage directly with folks that are most at risk of being involved in violence. And some of these community violence intervention programs in New Jersey and around the country are doing really critical life-saving work. I'll just use Oakland, California as an example. We did a study of Oakland a couple of years ago. And when Oakland had the appropriate resources, the appropriate commitment to fund these kinds of interventions, they dropped their homicide rate by 50%. They cut in half the number of people who were killed using these tried and true techniques. Other cities around the country have seen similar, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less success rates. But the key is, you can't just throw a little money at the problem and hope it happens. You have to build an infrastructure. You have to sustain the investments in these programs. But I think they're a critical tool in the sort of toolbox that we can use to try and save lives from gun violence.
Is that maybe where you see the biggest, upside for advancement, I'll say this, and that we've got the Supreme Court that we've got, right? We've got a polarization that we see from from state to state. Some states just seem to intentionally be moving in what I'd say is the wrong direction, and certainly other states are working hard to protect what we've got under the Supreme Court. Given that dynamic, is the space you're talking about where we've got community groups who know the challenges but who also know how to break those cycles, is that where you see the most potential for upside in terms of reducing gun violence and enhancing gun safety, or do you see it still through legal challenges and some of these other means as well?
Look, I think it's an all hands on deck. It's kind of every strategy you can pursue. All of the above, I guess, would be my approach to what we need to do to take on this epidemic. But I do think that this community violence intervention strategy is a key strategy within the overall approach that we take. And one of the reasons I say that both because they've been proven time and again to be especially effective, but also because when it comes to passing gun laws, it's a one step forward, two steps back, or sometimes two forward, one back. But, we pass these laws, they're immediately challenged by the gun lobby. If we land in front of a dangerous right-wing extremist judge, sometimes they'll strike down the laws. You have to go up on appeal and, see what we've just experienced in New Jersey with concealed carry. So it can be, it's not as straightforward as, writing a bill, going to the legislature, passing it, and assuming the problem's going to get better. We need to ensure that we can defend those laws in court. We need to ensure that they're implemented properly, and effectively. Just passing a law on paper doesn't do anything if those on the ground are not understanding what the implications are and how to enforce it and how to implement effective gun policy. So, we at Giffords will not stop fighting for better laws to defend the laws that are on the books, to ensure adequate resourcing for violence intervention programs. We fight on all fronts, trying to make sure that we elect gun sense champions who, are committed not to doing the bidding of the gun lobby, but to doing the bidding of keeping people safe. So it's a multi-front strategy. And I think all of the pieces, it's hard to quantify which is most important and which is comparatively less important. But our view is, this problem is of a scale where, shootings are the leading cause of death for children and teens in this country, more than disease, more than motor vehicle injury. And I think when shootings are the leading cause of death for children, there's a real problem. There's a problem that demands everything we can do to address it. And that's why we take the approach that we have. Unfortunately, the last several years have been really incredibly difficult with the pandemic and COVID. And unfortunately, in 2020 and 2021, we saw record increases in gun violence across the whole country. There's increases in gun violence almost in every community across the country, certainly in every state. Thankfully, due in large part to the work of policymakers and law enforcement and the governor and attorney general, New Jersey has seen that trend reverse last year. And thankfully, the rates of gun violence are coming down fairly uniformly across the whole state and in many states and cities across the country. But having said that, even these positive trends in bringing rates of homicide down, there's still too many people, being killed by guns, whether that's in mass shootings, whether that's in day-to-day, violence in communities that have these shootings virtually every single day, or whether that's gun suicide. There's twice as many gun suicides in this country, give or take, as other gun deaths combined. So, it's a problem that is killing far too many people. It's a problem that doesn't exist in similar countries around the world. It's just we are uniquely off the charts in a way that I wish wasn't the case. But it's a problem that we can make progress on, whether getting bipartisan legislation through Congress, whether working at the community level in New Jersey and across the country. So we know there are solutions. They do work. We are working every day to make sure that they're happening. But nonetheless, it's still a problem that persists in an unfortunate way.
Well, I think a lot of what you said there, and you mentioned it, is dependent on, electing the right individuals who care about gun safety and making sure you've got people who defend, gun safety laws and people who pass, strong gun safety measures and so on and so forth. So that's a huge piece of it. But even in those instances, there's that conversation that has to happen with someone on the other side of that. And often we hear, appreciate everything that you're saying, but there's this thing called the Second Amendment, and I have the right to own a gun. I have the right to do all these things. How do you have that conversation when you're trying to reconcile the tension that some create around, common sense gun safety measures and laws, versus the Second Amendment, which seems to be somewhat of a false choice. But how do you engage in that space when you're trying to, impress upon someone that there's still things that can be done, even though someone may be, fully in line with the Second Amendment?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing you can do is talk about these community violence intervention programs, because those are trying to, meet people where they are and give them the support that they need to be able to choose options other than violence. And, those are programs that don't look to take anyone's guns away or prevent somebody from getting guns. So, funding those kinds of programs doesn't interfere with anybody's gun rights and should be non-controversial. So that's one of the ways that you deal with that. But, on this, I think you're absolutely right, Sean, that there are folks out there that, will say the Second Amendment is absolute. It means you can't regulate any guns. I can, have as many guns. I mean, there are people out there that literally think the Second Amendment makes it acceptable for civilians to have fighter jets and, and tanks and howitzers and those sorts of things. I think the vast majority of Americans would find that to be an alarming position and would disagree. So there are extremists that, say you can't have any gun law and the most modest regulation of guns, infringes the Second Amendment. You have folks on the other side who are, a small number of people that think, every single gun in the country is bad and the only way we have to get rid of every single gun. And I think, the vast majority of public opinion of the public and really common sense when you think about laws and regulations fall in the middle. And, the vast majority of people, whatever their feelings about guns or whether they own guns or not, understand the Second Amendment provides some protection of the ability to own and use guns, but that common sense regulations don't violate the Constitution and are consistent. And if you look at, American history, there have been guns in this country from the founding era, but there have also been gun laws. There have been strong gun regulations, and gun possession and gun regulation have always gone hand in hand. And that doesn't violate the Constitution or the Second Amendment. We have part of our organization is a coalition called Gun Owners for Safety, and these are gun owners, as the name would indicate, but they are advocating to strengthen laws because they know, first of all, that if we don't have any regulation of guns, it's going to make everyone more at risk. It's going to make everyone more dangerous, and it's going to, potentially undercut their ability to lawfully own and use guns. And so, our gun owners for safety advocate for the kinds of laws we've been talking about all along, with the knowledge that those laws can exist. They can still own guns as long as they're responsible, as long as they follow the law, and that nobody's Second Amendment rights are being trampled upon. So yes, there are extremes on either side of the debate that, say, any one gun law is too much or any one gun is too much in society. But the vast majority of people, I think, fall, in a much more middle ground area where they, accept or believe in the right to own guns, but also accept and support the idea that we should regulate them.
When you talk about that middle ground and most people, and I guess maybe I'd ask you to lean back on some of your previous work that you've done in other spaces as well, maybe even at the Brennan Center. But it seems I'm guessing and just noting that I think many people thought we've been in a middle ground. We're trying to advance in some spaces, but when you talk about some of the challenges that we've seen, especially under the Supreme Court, and when we seem to be rolling back on gun safety measures, rolling back specifically on voting rights, which I know was some of the work that you've been involved in. When you're talking about rolling back, reproductive rights, when you're rolling, it just seems like a lot of these things are moving backwards. And certainly part of the work we do, protecting our democracy, as it speaks to, is is the impact of a lot of these things on our democracy itself. And certainly so obvious when you talk about voting rights, but when you also talk about reproductive freedoms, when you also talk about the ability to exist and live safely, free from gun violence. How impactful do you see all of these things, or how connected do you see all of these things in terms of challenging our very democracy?
Well, I think they're all intertwined. They're all very connected. And, we have a project at Giffords called our Guns and Democracy Project. And, part of what we focus on is real basic stuff. Like, you can't have people marching around outside polling places with guns, intimidating voters. You shouldn't have people at ballot drop boxes or outside election officials' houses threatening election officials as they're trying to tally the vote. And, I won't dwell on the point, but some of the things we've seen in the last few years are really troubling about what they say about people's willingness to use violence if they are not getting electoral or legal outcomes that they support. So we're very concerned about the use of guns to threaten our democracy. But we're also, concerned about the use of guns, whether you're talking about a school board meeting or, municipal government meeting, the presence of guns in and around those kinds of civic functions, those critical democratic functioning, when guns are introduced into the mix, or protests, but people protesting or having rallies, when counter protesters show up with guns, I think it's intuitive. You don't need to explain a great deal that that's going to chill people's First Amendment rights, and that guns can really corrode, our fundamental democratic values and our fundamental democratic institutions. So that's an area that we're working on. But I think the key is, all of this to me just underscores the importance of folks getting involved, folks advocating, whether it's policymakers or supporting candidates who are running on platforms that you support. We've seen the Supreme Court do some terrible things. I think that's really motivated a lot of voters to get involved, whether it's to go to a march, to go to a protest, or to vote, or to make phone calls, or canvas for a candidate who's running on the right issues. So I think, the answer to these threats to our democracy is more democracy, it's more engagement, it's more commitment to do what needs to be done. Some folks out there might write a check to support a candidate. Other folks might not have a lot of money to contribute, but they might be able to spend time and knock doors and make calls. So I think, whether it's reproductive freedom, whether it's reasonable gun regulation, or whether it's the environment or any number of other subjects, the only way for us to make sure our democracy keeps protecting us, providing us a safe place to live, and respecting our freedoms and our rights is for us to lean in and make sure our democracy is working. So, I have a specific focus on guns now, but I see that within the context of the threats to our democracy and the need for us to redouble our commitments. And that's why I'm so glad to be able to speak with you today, and to thank you for all the important work that you're doing on that critically important issue.
No, well, I mean, let's our democracy. Let's see if we can keep it here. I mean, it is about engaging, right, on so many fronts, and you just noted a bunch of different spaces where people may have specific passions, but each one helps to strengthen our democracy, and we've got to be mindful of that. It's not a given, and it takes a lot of work, and we got to continue to work at it. Maybe I'll ask this in closing, and I know you started with it. We talked about a little bit the bipartisan legislation, so certainly positive there, but we also talked about a lot of the challenges with the Supreme Court and some of the things we're seeing as well. So I guess I'll ask, what gives you the most hope? What causes you to be optimistic? Despite the things that we read in the headlines so often, and despite the statistics that show us what's happening, what are you most optimistic about? And what just encourages you that we're going to move in the right direction here?
Well, look, I don't think, whether it's democracy, whether it's guns, whether it's any of the other issues we're talking about, I don't think you can keep, focusing and plugging away every day if you don't have some kind of optimism. The numbers are devastating. The stories we read about on a daily, if not sometimes feels like an hourly basis, are devastating. But it's too important, the stakes are too important. And, so I see each, incremental success that we have, whether it's passing a strong bill in Trenton, whether it's passing a great law in Washington, or whether it's just, hearing an anecdote for somebody, a community worker who, has a story about somebody who was thinking about picking up a gun and trying to get revenge and, came around and said, you know what, I'm making a different choice. Every single one of those little success stories, and they're out there. They're a ton of them, give me the optimism to say, look, it may feel like there's 3 setbacks for every 1 step forward, or, it's a steep hill to be climbing, but you got to just see those little successes along the way and use them and try and harness them to gain some momentum. So I hope, whether it's on guns, whether it's on democracy or anything else, folks who rightly so realize we're living in challenging times can hold on to those kernels of hope, can harness that optimism, and can keep working, because we got to all keep working.
Well, I have to tell you, there's a lot of, sometimes just heartbreaking issues that we discuss on these podcasts and these talks that we have. But what I'm always inspired by, and certainly inspired by with the work that you're doing, is the good work that people continue to do to continue to support and fight for our democracy, and specifically here for gun safety, and to try and make our nation a little bit safer for everybody, and that is inspiration in and of itself. So I just want to say, thanks so much for being on, but just as, and more importantly, thanks for the work you do. It really, it makes a difference, and certainly know that it does, and that you provide inspiration to so many others. So thank you for being with us today.
Well, I appreciate you saying so. Appreciate you having me on, and thank you for your continued leadership and terrific work that you're doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it.